He watched her every move with disgust, convinced she was stealing from him. But what Sterling Maddox discovered when he followed his maid would shatter everything he believed about the woman who cleaned his floors. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the ranch house as Sterling Maddox stood behind the heavy curtains of his study, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the figure hunched over his kitchen floor. Cora Whitmore moved with mechanical precision, her worn dress clinging to her thin frame as she scrubbed away at stains that had been there since morning. Her brown hair, always pulled back in the same tired knot, had wisps escaping around her face, damp with sweat. Sterling's jaw tightened as he watched her work. For 3 months now, he'd noticed things going missing from his house, small things at first. A silver spoon, some coins left on his desk, a bottle of expensive whiskey that seemed to empty faster than it should. His mind immediately went to the most obvious suspect, the poor woman who had access to every room in his house. The way she avoided his eyes when he spoke to her only confirmed his suspicions. The way she quickly pocketed her wages without a word of thanks. The way she seemed to hurry through her work, as if eager to leave with whatever she'd managed to steal that day. He stepped away from the window, his expensive boots clicking against the polished wood floor. Sterling Maddox was not a man who tolerated theft, especially not from someone he'd shown the kindness of employing despite her obvious desperation. He'd built his fortune through careful attention to detail and trusting no one. And he wasn't about to let some desperate woman make a fool of him. As he watched Cora gather her cleaning supplies, Sterling made a decision that would change everything. Today, he would follow her. Today, he would discover exactly where his missing belongings were going and what this woman was really doing with the money he paid her. Ka stood slowly, her hand pressing against her lower back as if it pained her. She collected her worn shawl from the hook by the kitchen door and wrapped it around her shoulders despite the heat. Sterling noticed how she glanced nervously toward his study, as if sensing his presence before stepping out into the blazing afternoon. Sterling waited exactly 30 seconds before moving to the front window. He watched as Cora walked down the dusty path that led away from his ranch, her pace steady but unhurried. She carried herself with a strange dignity despite her circumstances, something that had always irritated him. Poor people, in his experience, should look grateful for any work they could get. He grabbed his hat from the rack and slipped out the back door, keeping low as he made his way to where his horse waited in the stable. The animal, a powerful chestnut stallion, barely made a sound as Sterling mounted and began following the small figure walking along the dirt road. The sun beat down relentlessly as Sterling kept his distance, using the scattered trees and rock formations to stay hidden. Cora walked with purpose, taking a route he'd never seen her use before. Instead of heading toward the main part of town where the other servants and laborers lived, she turned off onto a smaller path that led toward the old abandoned section on the outskirts. Sterling's suspicions grew stronger with each step. What business could she possibly have in that area? The only things out there were empty buildings and the kind of people who preferred to stay hidden from decent folk. His missing belongings were probably being sold to some fence, or worse, she was meeting with accomplices to plan bigger thefts from his property. As they crested a small hill, Sterling could see Cora's destination in the distance. It was an old wooden structure, paint peeling and roof sagging, that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. Smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting someone was living there. Though Sterling couldn't imagine who would choose such a place, he dismounted and tied his horse to a sturdy tree, then crept closer on foot. The building was larger than it had appeared from a distance, and as he drew near, he could hear something that made him pause. Voices, children's voices, and they were calling out a name that made his blood run cold. Miss Cora, Miss Cora's back. Sterling pressed himself against the side of the building, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Through a gap in the weathered boards, he could see inside, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through that crack in the weathered wood, Sterling saw a sight that made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. 6 children, ranging from what looked like 5 to 12 years old, surrounded Cora as she entered the ramshackle building. Their clothes were patched and faded, but clean. Their faces were thin, but bright with genuine joy at seeing her. But it was what Ka did next that stopped Sterling's breath entirely. She reached into her worn cloth bag and pulled out items he recognized immediately: bread from his kitchen, apples from his orchards, and a small jar of preserves from his pantry. Not stolen goods to be sold, but food to feed hungry children. Sterling watched in stunned silence as Ka knelt down to the children's level, her tired face transforming into something beautiful as she smiled at them. A little girl with blonde braids threw her arms around Cora's neck, and Sterling could see tears in his maid's eyes as she held the child close. "Did you bring medicine for Tommy?" asked a boy who couldn't have been more than 8, his voice filled with worry. Cora nodded and pulled out a small bottle that Sterling now realized was the expensive tonic he'd thought she'd stolen from his medicine cabinet. She moved toward a makeshift bed in the corner where a smaller boy lay, his face flushed with fever. Sterling watched as she carefully measured out the medicine, her hands steady and sure. The boy who'd asked about Tommy looked up at Cora with eyes that held too much responsibility for his age. "The rent man came by again today, Miss Cora. He says, if we don't have the money by week's end." Cora's shoulders sagged slightly, but she forced another smile. "Don't you worry about that now, Marcus. We ll figure something out." Sterling felt something crack inside his chest as he watched this woman he despised and suspected, reach into her small purse and count out what looked like every penny she had. The money he'd paid her just hours ago, money she desperately needed, was being divided among the children for their basic needs. Through the gap, he could see the interior of the building more clearly now. It was barely holding together with gaps in the walls stuffed with old rags to keep out the wind. The floor was clean but worn smooth by years of use. In one corner, someone had tried to create a small school area with a few books and a slate board. In another, a cooking area with the most basic of supplies. But despite the poverty, despite the obvious struggles, there was something in this place that Sterling had never seen in his own grand house. Love, real unconditional love flowing between these forgotten children and the woman who was sacrificing everything to care for them. Cora began unpacking more items from her bag: soap, clean rags, what looked like portions of the dinner she should have taken home for herself. Sterling realized with growing horror that every theft he suspected her of was actually an act of mercy toward children who had nothing. "Miss Cora," the little blonde girl tugged at her dress, "are you going to stay for supper tonight?" Cora smoothed the child's hair with infinite tenderness. "I'm afraid I can't tonight, sweet pea. I have to get home before dark, but I'll be back tomorrow. Promise." The child's voice held the kind of desperation that spoke of too many broken promises from adults. "I promise," Cora whispered, and Sterling could hear the absolute conviction in her voice. This woman would keep her word to these children, even if it killed her. As Sterling watched, Cora began helping the children prepare their meager meal, turning the small amount of food she'd brought into something that would somehow feed them all. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make miracles out of nothing. The sick boy, Tommy, called out weakly from his bed, and Cora immediately went to him, pressing her hand to his forehead and whispering words of comfort. Sterling could see the worry in her face, the way she bit her lip as she felt the child's fever. "Marcus," she called softly to the older boy, "has he been drinking the willow bark tea I showed you how to make?" "Yes, Miss Cora, but it doesn't seem to be helping much." Sterling watched as his maid, no, this angel who'd been working in his house, knelt beside the sick child and began singing a soft lullaby. Her voice was beautiful, filled with the kind of love that could heal hearts, if not bodies, but it was what happened next that would change Sterling Maddox forever. As Ka sang, she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out something that made Sterling's blood freeze in his veins. It was the silver locket he'd thought she'd stolen, the one that had belonged to his late mother, but instead of selling it as he'd assumed, Cora was showing it to the children, and what she said next shattered every assumption he'd ever made about her. "This belonged to a lady who was very kind to me once," Cora said softly, holding the silver locket so the children could see it gleam in the dim light. "She told me that sometimes when we're scared or lonely, we can hold something beautiful and remember that there's still good in the world." Sterling's hands trembled as he pressed against the wall. That locket had been his mother's most treasured possession, and he'd been searching for it frantically for weeks. But Ka wasn't planning to sell it. She was using it to bring comfort to frightened children. Little Tommy reached out a weak hand to touch the locket, and Cora gently placed it in his palm. "You hold on to this tonight, sweetheart. Let it remind you that you're loved." Sterling felt his throat close up as he watched this scene unfold. The locket that represented his family's legacy, his mother's memory, was being used exactly as his mother would have wanted, to bring hope to someone who needed it most. Marcus, the older boy, moved closer to Cora with obvious reluctance. "Miss Cora, I need to tell you something about the money." Cora's face immediately filled with concern. "What about it?" "I heard the rent man talking to someone outside. He said, if we can't pay, he's not just going to throw us out. He said, there are people who pay good money for children who don't have families to look for them." The color drained from Cora's face, and Sterling felt ice form in his veins. He knew exactly what the boy was talking about. The kind of people who preyed on vulnerable children, selling them into situations no child should ever face. "How much time do we have?" Cora's voice was steady, but Sterling could see her hands shaking. 3 days, Marcus whispered. "Miss Cora, what are we going to do?" Sterling watched as Ka pulled all the children into a tight circle around her. Despite the terror that must have been coursing through her, she managed to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "We're going to figure this out," she said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to any of you, I promise." But Sterling could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she was calculating and recalculating in her head, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. The amount these children owed was more than Ka made in 3 months working for him. As he watched, Ka began settling the children for the night, tucking thin blankets around each one and making sure they felt safe despite the threat hanging over them. She sang softly as she moved between them, her voice carrying a strength that belied her small frame. When the last child had drifted off to sleep, Sterling saw Cora sink into the single chair in the room, her head falling into her hands. For the first time since he'd been watching, she allowed herself to show the full weight of her burden. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that she muffled against her palms, careful not to wake the children. Sterling felt something break open inside his chest as he watched this woman he judged so harshly, cry alone in the darkness. She was carrying the weight of 6 lives on her shoulders, sacrificing everything she had, and still it wasn't enough. But what Sterling saw next would haunt him forever. Ka reached into her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Even from his hidden position, Sterling could see it was a letter worn from being read many times. As she unfolded it, a small de jure type fell out, and Sterling's world tilted on its axis. The photograph was of a man in military uniform, and the resemblance to little Tommy was unmistakable, but it was what Ka whispered as she looked at the image that stopped Sterling's heart cold. "I'm sorry, James," Cora whispered to the photograph, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I couldn't save him in time. I'm sorry I couldn't save any of them." Sterling felt the ground shift beneath him as the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The man in the uniform, the resemblance to Tommy, the way Ka spoke about these children as if she'd failed them somehow. She wasn't just a stranger helping orphans. These children were connected to her in ways he was only beginning to understand. Cora pressed the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes. "I promised I'd take care of them all. I promised I'd keep them together, but I'm failing just like I failed with their fathers." Sterling watched as she carefully refolded the letter and tucked it back into her dress. Then she stood and moved quietly to check on each sleeping child, adjusting blankets and smoothing hair with the tenderness of a mother. When she reached Tommy's bed, she knelt beside him and gently took back the silver locket, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. The boy stirred slightly in his sleep, and Ka began humming the same lullaby she'd sung earlier. It was then that Sterling noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the flickering candlelight, he could see that Cora's hands were shaking violently, and her face had taken on a grayish pallor. She was ill, seriously ill, and had been hiding it while caring for these children. As if sensing his observation, Cora suddenly swayed on her feet and had to grip the edge of Tommy's bed to keep from falling. She pressed her hand to her chest, her breathing becoming labored, but she forced herself to remain quiet so as not to wake the children. Sterling realized with growing horror that this woman was literally sacrificing her life for these children. She was sick, possibly dying, and instead of seeking help for herself, she was spending every penny she earned and every ounce of strength she had to keep them safe. But what happened next would change everything Sterling thought he knew about sacrifice and love. Cora reached into her bag and pulled out one more item, something Sterling hadn't seen her take from his house. It was his father's gold pocket watch, the one he'd inherited and treasured above all his possessions, the one he'd been frantically searching for and had been certain she'd stolen. But instead of keeping it or selling it, Cora was looking at it with the expression of someone about to make the ultimate sacrifice. Sterling watched in stunned silence as she traced the engraving on the watch's surface. His family's initials intertwined in elegant script. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the watch as if it could hear her. "I'm sorry it has to be this way, but they need this more than anyone needs to know the truth." Sterling's mind raced as he tried to understand what she meant. What truth? What connection could this woman possibly have to his family's watch that would make her speak to it as if it held secrets? Cora stood slowly, still clutching the watch, and moved toward a loose floorboard in the corner of the room. Sterling watched as she pried it up and placed the watch inside what appeared to be a small hiding place. But she wasn't hiding it to keep it. She was hiding it to protect it until she could sell it to save the children. As she replaced the floorboard, Cora swayed again, this time more violently. She pressed both hands to her chest, and Sterling could see her struggling to breathe. Whatever illness was consuming her was getting worse, and the stress of the children's situation was accelerating her decline. But it was what she did next that revealed the final devastating truth about who Cora Whitmore really was and why she had Sterling Maddox's most precious family heirloom. Cora reached into her dress once more and pulled out another letter, this one sealed and yellowed with age. Sterling could see his own name written across the front and handwriting he didn't recognize. As she held it, her lips moved in what looked like a prayer, and then she spoke words that shattered Sterling's understanding of everything. I should have given this to him when I first came to work at the ranch. She whispered to the sleeping children, but I was too proud, too ashamed, and now it might be too late for all of us. Sterling pressed closer to the gap in the wall, his heart hammering as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A letter addressed to him in the possession of his maid, hidden away like a secret that could change everything. Cora moved to the single candle burning in the room and held the letter near the flame, as if considering destroying it. But then she looked at the children, and her resolve seemed to weaken. She couldn't destroy their only hope, no matter how much shame it might bring her. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said softly to little Tommy, who stirred but didn't wake. "He tried to do right by everyone, even when it cost him everything. Maybe his son has some of that same goodness in him." Sterling felt his knees buckle as the implications of her words hit him. His grandfather had died when Sterling was young, but he'd been known throughout the territory for his fairness and compassion. What connection could Cora possibly have to his family that went back that far? As if an answer to his thoughts, Cora began speaking again, her voice growing weaker with each word. "I should have told Mr. Maddox the truth from the beginning," she said, sinking back into the chair. "Should have told him that these children, she couldn't finish the sentence, but Sterling could see the weight of whatever secret she carried crushing her spirit." Suddenly, Cora's breathing became even more labored, and she doubled over in pain. Sterling watched in alarm as she gripped the arms of the chair, her face contorting in agony. The illness that had been slowly consuming her was reaching a critical point, and she was alone with 6 children depending on her. But even in her pain, Cora's first thought was for the children. She forced herself to stand and checked each one, making sure they were still sleeping peacefully. Then she moved to a small shelf and pulled down a bottle of what looked like medicine, but Sterling could see that it was nearly empty. As she measured out a small dose herself, Sterling realized she'd been rationing her own medicine, probably giving most of it to Tommy and the other children when they were sick. She was literally dying so that they could live. The medicine seemed to help slightly, and Cora's breathing eased enough for her to move around the room again, but Sterling could see that it was temporary relief at best. Without proper medical care, this woman wouldn't survive much longer. It was then that Ka did something that would change Sterling Maddox forever. She picked up the letter with his name on it and kissed it gently, then placed it on the small table where he would be sure to see it if he ever came looking for his stolen possessions. "Forgive me," she whispered, though Sterling couldn't tell if she was speaking to him, to the children, or to someone else entirely. "Forgive me for being too proud to ask for help when these innocents needed it most." As Cora prepared to leave the children for the night, Sterling saw her take one last look around the room. Her eyes lingered on each sleeping face, and Sterling could see her memorizing them, as if she knew this might be one of the last times she'd see them. But what Sterling witnessed in her final moments in that room would reveal the truth that would transform his life and show him what real nobility looked like. Cora knelt beside each child one final time, whispering something to each sleeping form that Sterling had to strain to hear. When she reached little Tommy, her words became clear. "Your papa was the bravest man I ever knew," she whispered. "He saved my life and your grandfather's life, and he never asked for anything in return. I'm sorry I couldn't save yours the same way." Sterling's mind reeled as more pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. His grandfather, these children's fathers, some act of bravery that connected them all, and somehow Cora was at the center of it. When she reached Marcus, the oldest boy, Cora's voice broke completely. "Your father died protecting something precious," she whispered. "Something that belonged to people who mattered to him. I should have told them the truth years ago, but I was afraid they'd think I was lying, trying to take advantage." Sterling watched as Cora stood slowly, her hand pressed to her chest where the pain was clearly intensifying. She moved to a small wooden box in the corner and opened it carefully. Inside, Sterling could see more photographs, letters, and what looked like military medals. Cora lifted out one of the medals, and even in the dim light, Sterling could see it was a commendation for bravery. As she held it, she began speaking as if the sleeping children could hear her. 6 good men died saving the life of Sterling. Maddox's grandfather during the Apache raids 20 years ago, she said, her voice filled with pride and sorrow. 6 men who left behind children they loved more than life itself. Men who could have run, could have saved themselves, but chose to stand and fight because honor meant more to them than safety. Sterling felt the world tilt beneath him as the full truth began to emerge. These children, these orphaned, desperate children he'd watched Cora sacrifice everything for, were the sons and daughters of heroes who had died saving his own family. Cora pulled out another photograph, this one showing 6 men in military uniform standing with an older man, Sterling, now recognized as his grandfather. Resemblances were unmistakable. Marcus had his father's strong jaw. Tommy had the same gentle eyes as the man who held the locket, and the little blonde girl sleeping peacefully had her father's bright smile. Your grandfather promised he'd take care of us. Cora continued speaking to the photograph. He promised that the families of the men who saved him would never want for anything, but he died before he could tell his grandson about us, and I was too proud to come forward with my hand out like a beggar. Sterling's throat constricted as he realized the magnitude of what he was witnessing. These children were his responsibility, had been his responsibility all along, his grandfather's debt of honor, unpaid because Sterling had never known it existed. Cora carefully returned the items to the box and closed it. As she did, Sterling could see her hands shaking more violently than before. The effort of moving around, of caring for the children while fighting her own illness, was taking its final toll. She moved toward the door, but stopped when she reached the table where she'd placed the letter addressed to Sterling. For a long moment she stared at it, her hand hovering over the envelope as if she were reconsidering her decision to leave it. "Maybe it's better this way," she whispered. "Maybe it's better if he never knows. The children will find other families," or she couldn't finish the thought. But Sterling knew what she was thinking. The children would disappear into a system that didn't care about them, or worse, into the hands of people who would exploit them. But it was what Ka did next that showed Sterling the true depth of her character. Instead of taking the letter back, instead of protecting herself from potential humiliation, she pulled out a pencil and added something to the envelope. Sterling watched as she wrote in shaky handwriting, "For the grandson of the man my husband died to save, these children are all that remains of 6 heroes. Please don't let their sacrifice be forgotten." As she finished writing, Cora swayed dangerously and had to grip the table to keep from falling. The combination of her illness, stress, and exhaustion was finally overwhelming her body's ability to cope. But even as she struggled to remain standing, her eyes went to the children one more time. "I kept my promise as long as I could," she whispered. "Please let someone else keep it now." Sterling watched in growing alarm as Ka made her way toward the door, her movements becoming more unsteady with each step. She was barely conscious, running on nothing but willpower and love for the children she was leaving behind. And Sterling suddenly realized that if he didn't act immediately, this woman was going to collapse before she ever made it home, and these children would wake up tomorrow to find themselves completely alone in the world. Sterling couldn't watch any longer. As Ka stumbled toward the door, her legs finally giving out beneath her, he abandoned his hiding spot and rushed forward. He caught her just as she fell, her frail body weighing almost nothing in his arms. "Please," she whispered weakly, looking up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only resignation. "Don't let them be separated. They're all each other has left." Sterling carried her inside and gently placed her in the chair. The children began to stir at the commotion, and little Tommy sat up, his fever-bright eyes widening as he saw the tall stranger holding Miss Cora. "It's all right," Sterling said softly, his voice catching as he spoke to children who had every reason to fear him. "I'm here to help." Marcus, protective even at his young age, moved to stand between Sterling and the younger children. "Who are you? What do you want with Miss Cora?" Sterling looked down at the boy who carried his father's brave spirit and felt his heart break completely. "My name is Sterling Maddox," he said quietly, "and I owe your fathers a debt I never knew existed." Cora tried to speak, but Sterling gently touched her shoulder. "Save your strength," he said. "I read the letter. I understand everything now." Over the next hour, as Sterling sat with the children gathered around him, Cora's weak voice filled in the details of the story that had shaped all their lives. How 6 brave men had chosen to stand and fight when Apache raiders threatened his grandfather's ranch. How they died protecting not just his family, but the families of other settlers who couldn't defend themselves. How his grandfather had promised to care for their children. A promise that died with him when Sterling was still too young to understand. "I should have come to you immediately," Cora whispered, her breathing growing more labored. "But I was proud, and I was afraid you'd think I was lying to get money from you." Sterling felt shame wash over him as he realized how wrong he'd been about everything. This woman hadn't been stealing from him. She'd been too honorable to ask for help she'd legitimately earned through her husband's sacrifice. The ranch, Sterling said suddenly, the solution coming to him with crystal clarity. "You'll all come live at the ranch. There's more than enough room in these children. They're family." Cora's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Maddox, we couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," Sterling said firmly. "It's justice. It's what should have happened 20 years ago." Within the week, Sterling had transformed a wing of his ranch house into a proper home for the children. He arranged for the best doctor in the territory to care for Cora, whose illness, caught in time, proved treatable with proper medicine and rest. Marcus found his calling working with the ranch horses, his natural leadership evident as he helped train the younger children. Tommy recovered completely from his fever and showed a remarkable aptitude for numbers, helping Sterling manage the ranch's accounts. The other children flourished in an environment where love and security replaced fear and hunger. As for Cora, she became far more than a housekeeper. She became the heart of a family that honored the memory of 6 heroes by ensuring their children grew up knowing their worth. Years later, when people asked Sterling about the children who called him Uncle Sterling, he would tell them simply, "They're the sons and daughters of the bravest men I never had the chance to meet. Taking care of them isn't charity. It's the greatest honor of my life." The silver lock, it was, returned to its place of honor in Sterling's family. But now it carried new meaning. It had brought comfort to a dying child, and revealed the truth that transformed a bitter man into someone worthy of the sacrifice made for his family. Sometimes the greatest treasures we possess aren't the ones we inherit, but the ones we choose to protect and nurture. And sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones who teach us what real honor looks like. Sterling Maddox learned that following someone can lead you to discover not their crimes but your own failures. And if you're brave enough to admit those failures, they can become the foundation for something beautiful. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and hidden courage, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a super chat. If you'd like to support us in bringing you more tales from the American frontier, your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of the human spirit. Check out another incredible Western story by clicking the video on your screen. You won't want to miss what happens next.